Everyone. I'm Sarah Markos, and I don't know if this is on. And my project is titled Coloniality of Humanitarian Aid, Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Refugee Camps. And my research was advised by Professor Diana Chigas. And just as a preface, I wanted to say that there will be reference to sexual violence throughout this presentation. So I wanted to start off by talking about how I came upon this research. I basically came upon it when in 2018, there was increased media reports on sexual violence within the international aid sector. And this increased attention was following a scandal within Oxfam when top officials were found to be engaging in sexual misconduct after the earthquake in 2010 in Haiti. And then after these media reports, that led to other reports in other aid settings, such as refugee camps. And some of these reports were, something that was interesting about these reports is that they would frame it as a surprising thing, when for a lot of people who have experience working in these settings or living in settings with a large presence of aid organizations, it is very present in the dynamics within the camps and the larger culture of impunity and abuse that exists. So what really drew me to the topics was exploring why there's such a disconnect between the view from the outside and what is actually happening within refugee camps. And once starting my topic, I knew that would be complicated, but I think as I kept on going with it, I realized more and more of its complexity. And the question that I kept on going back to is who is being silenced and why? And in asking this question, I want to look at which narratives are not being included in our conceptualization of refugees or our conceptualization of sexual violence in refugee camps, or more specifically, sexual violence perpetrated by aid workers in refugee camps. And in exploring this topic, I found that aid organizations, they're able to hold themselves as the moral gold standard, and this allows them to have moral authority over international affairs, or more specifically, refugee affairs. And having this moral authority allows them to absolve themselves from blame a lot of times in these allegations. And in asking this question of who is being silenced and why, you also run into contradictions of this image of aid organizations, because you begin to challenge our common conceptualizations and ask questions such as, if these organizations have moral authority over refugee affairs, why is it that the global South continues to bear the financial burden of the refugee crisis, when it is the Western countries that often have representations in these organizations that have authority over refugee affairs? And you also begin to ask why it is that in media portrayals of refugees, they're often portrayed as a threat while also a passive entity, and why it is that these organizations are able to ensure refugee rights while they don't have enforcement mechanisms in place to actually enforce these rights. So in asking these questions, I want to urge the importance of expanding the understanding of these organizations beyond this romanticized review, this romanticized perception of them, because by doing this, we could look towards their colonial history. And by doing that, we can see how the colonial history lends to the power dynamics that are at play today. And in doing this research, I also wanted to stress the importance of historicizing what is happening today, because I want to stress the fact that we cannot urge change for sexual violence in refugee camps by ignoring how the economic and political realities are what lend to these power dynamics, which is why I included this quote by Shahab Kevorkian. And in doing this research, I hope to challenge, look at critically who has power over knowledge production revolving refugee affairs. And in my research, I hope to do this by focusing specifically on the refugee narrative and looking at media sources and publications where that narrative is being told, and how that compares to how refugees are portrayed in media and politics. And I also, in further research, will be conducting interviews. And I will be continuing this topic as my senior thesis, where I hope to conduct more interviews and continue my findings. And I just included some photos from the news source I use that I think is an example of refugees being able to claim self-determination over their narrative. And Kakuma News Reflector is the only independent refugee news publications where I got these images from. And that's all. Thank you.
So Kakuma News Reflector, who is writing the articles in these publications?
So Kakuma News Reflector, it was started by someone named Kataba Boru, who's actually a refugee there. And he wanted to start this because I guess in the mission statement, they're talking about how a lot of the times the UNHCR has control over what's happening, especially in Kakuma, because it's a very large camp where there's a lot of initiatives being done and a really large presence of like NGOs and aid organizations. And so he employed refugees there to write the articles. And because of that, they don't get any funding from the UNHCR, and they're also a lot of the times attempted to be dismantled by the UNHCR. So they rely on donations from the outside to be able to get income for reporting on these stories.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering how you got to like coloniality as like a framework to understand your project, if that's something you started with or it's something that you evolved towards.
It's something I evolved towards for sure, because I think when I was starting the topic, I was initially just like intrigued by the increase of media reports. And then after looking at that, I started looking at public health literature regarding sexual violence. And something I find a lot in public health literature is that they often don't look at like the history leading to what's happening today. And something that I found was missing within that is a lot of times they didn't really evaluate the power dynamics of aid workers and refugees. So I wanted to look towards the coloniality and looking at literature regarding like coloniality and humanitarianism to see how that could apply to refugee camps, because that connection isn't made as much.
I know I had brought this up a little bit earlier when we were talking, but I kind of wanted to open it up for the ideas of other people too. But have you seen any literature about other organizations, other aid organizations that might not be coming from a Western perspective? And maybe if in those organizations as well, maybe from other countries such as China, are they experiencing similar, would you think that they're experiencing similar experiences like this?
I haven't looked into literature on that specifically, but I could imagine that like perhaps there is that same relationship. A lot of reports that come out about these aid organizations, they're not like too public even so, because a lot of these reports are attempted to be covered up. So I would expect if there are allegations of sexual violence, maybe they exist, but maybe they're not as out to the public, but I can't really speak on that. But I think it would be interesting to look at that relationship and how it could relate to this.
And then just a follow-up question. So is the sexual violence being perpetrated against, say in this example, the refugees in the camp or the workers in the camp, or both?
Both. For the research I was looking at, I look at mostly it being perpetrated by refugees, just to, I guess, narrow the scope a bit. But a lot of there are articles coming up about people within aid organizations also speaking out against this, because they face also barriers into speaking out against this. And also there's like a culture of like trying to like protect the name of the organization. So it is something that exists within aid workers and the refugees as well.
Any other questions? Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you.